So I was looking at this video on Tovia Singer's YouTube channel, which has the provocative title, Rabbi Tovia Singer, Christians corrupted Psalm 212 and inserted a bogus phrase, kiss the sun. And, you know, you can see the video on your screen, and I'll share a link in the video description, right? Now, the video's over 20 minutes long, and I would have to play quite a bit of it for his full argument to become clear from the clip. So I hope you'll forgive me if I just attempt to give a brief summary, and then, you know, interested viewers can watch his video and compare it to my summary, right? But basically, he's sharing his reasons for why he disagrees with the translation, kiss the sun, for the first two words which appear in Psalm 212, those words being nashku, bar, right? And in a vacuum, his general argument is fair, right? For example, a major point, it's not his only point, but a major point is that the text is Hebrew, therefore one is within their rights to interpret the word bar as the Hebrew word for purity rather than the Aramaic word for sun, right? However, where the video goes off the rails for me, right, and where for me it seems to warrant a response, is the way that Tovia waves off that phrase as bogus nonsense, right? And you know, you see that appear in the title, and in the video itself, right, he used that precise phrase, bogus nonsense. I think he said abject bogus nonsense, right? And he refers to one who might hold to such an interpretation as a silly boy, or he applied that to like someone who might try to make recourse to Proverbs 31. You know, and in fact, he was saying that the tendency to turn to the use of bar in Proverbs 31, he treats that like as a sort of distinctly Christian game, right? And moreover, you know, as I said, there's that provocative title to the video itself saying that, you know, this is a specifically Christian corruption of this text, and, you know, specifically Christians inserted this bogus phrase into it, you know, etc., right? Now, I don't know if Tovia chose that title or if like one of his assistants chose the title to the video without checking with him, but even if it's the latter, right, even if just that's the title was chosen by one of his assistants, it's still worth noting how even his own assistant might interpret his words in this video, right? So we're going to dive into this really quickly, but before we do so, just to be clear, I want to put out the disclaimer that in this video, I'm not saying that you have to interpret the text as meaning kiss the sun, right? It's worth noting that neither the Septuagint nor the Vulgate interpret the text that way. So I fully acknowledge up front that other interpretations are fair or possible, right? But this, like I said, this whole thing sort of just goes off the rails when Tovia or his YouTube page starts saying to kiss the sun, that interpretation is nonsense and it's bogus and it's a Christian insertion, it's a distinctly Christian corruption, right, etc., right? That's where it seems like this becomes unfair, and that's where I think this warrants a response, right? So I would say that, you know, honestly, and with all due respect to Tovia Singer, this is one of perhaps multiple instances where Tovia seems to conveniently neglect or perhaps forget or perhaps not be aware of what appears within significant text within the rabbinic spectrum, right? It's worth noting that Tovia is not a Karaite, right? He's an Orthodox Jew. He's part of the rabbinic spectrum. So while I'm not going to say that he has to necessarily agree with a particular opinion found within the rabbinic spectrum, at the very least, the opinion of a significant scholar or a significant commentator within the rabbinic spectrum is at the very least worthy of note, right? And therefore, I'd like to show you how no less an authority, no less a scholar than ᶜEzra interpreted this verse. So, you know, I'm in a copy of Miqra'ot Gedolot, which, you know, it has the biblical text up here, and then, you know, you have these different commentaries, you know, by Rashi and ᶜEzra, which we're going to look at. And perhaps it's worth noting the phrase, because this is going to come up in a moment, the way verse 11 starts, where verse 11 begins with Abdou et Adonai. Now it has the tetragrammaton. For the sake of our Jewish friends, I'll just say Adonai rather than pronounce the tetragrammaton. But, you know, serve the Lord, right? So think of verse 12 starting with verse 11 with this declaration of serve the Lord. That's going to be relevant to ᶜEzra's interpretation, which is right here. So as you see the heading right there, this is the interpretation of ᶜEzra on this particular passage. And the text on specifically verse 12, he begins here, right? Nashku bar, right? And this is what ᶜEzra says, right? He says, Hine abdu et Adonai. So the portion in verse 11, which reads, serve the Lord, keneged al Adonai, right? Is in contradistinction to, or is different from, or is opposed to, upon the Lord, which is actually, the reader is expected to understand that here he's referring to verse 2, where it talks about the rulers who are plotting on the Lord, or plotting against the Lord. And then he says, with nashku bar, right, the text that's at the center of this discussion, nashku bar keneged al-MaseeHee. So the portion which says to engage in this action with a certain bar, that corresponds to when verse 2 it doesn't correspond, but it's opposed to, it's the opposite of what verse 2 is talking about when it talks about the world leaders, or the rulers of the world who are plotting against the Lord's anointed, right? And then he goes on, he says, wehine pirush bar, right? The plain meaning of bar, kemo, it's like the text, ma bari uma bar bitni, that's the very text from Proverbs 31, which Tovia says that certain Christians invoke, and that, Tovia treats that as some sort of like ridiculous Christian game, right? It's just like it's almost as if Tovia was saying that was nonsense, but here we see Ibn Ezra invoking a phrase, the use of bar from Proverbs 31 to interpret bar in Psalms 2. And then he says, Waken katuv, as it's written, beniata, which is from verse 7 in Psalms 2, right? So basically, Ibn Ezra was saying that when Psalm 2:11 says, serve the Lord, that is the opposite of what the rulers were doing in Psalm 2:2 when they're plotting against the Lord. And when Psalms 2:12 refers to an action taken with a certain bar, that is likewise the opposite of what those rulers are doing against the Lord's anointed. And when Psalms 2:12 refers to a certain bar, it does indeed mean son. And it's referring to the same individual called son in Psalm 2:7. That's the opinion of Ibn Ezra, and now, again, I'm not saying Tovia or any other Orthodox Jew has to agree with Ibn Ezra's interpretation, but at the very least, noting Ibn Ezra's interpretation, we need to stop with this idea that the interpretation which was being maligned in his video is purely some Christian invention, right? Noting Ibn Ezra's interpretation, roughly that the idea would, Ibn Ezra's idea would have to be taken as a legitimate possibility within the spectrum of rabbinic thought, right? We're not talking about some unknown rabbi somewhere in Crown Heights. We're talking about Ibn Ezra, right? And so that's all I wanted to say on this, to show that, as is sometimes the case when with topics which Tovia Singer tackles in his somewhat polite but also somewhat polemical way, the issue can sometimes be more complex than his depiction of it lets on, right? So I hope that's clear. And on that note, I'll close this brief video here. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.